The Mirror of Erised shows the person who looks into it the deepest, most desperate desire of their hearts. But there's only a few people from the Harry Potter series who actually encounter it. Harry, Ron, and Professor Quirrell are the only characters where we find out what they see when they look into the mirror. But that's in the very first book, and things might change over time for them. Certainly for Harry and Ron anyway, but not for Quirrell because, well, he dies. But I thought it would be fun to explore what the characters might see if they looked into the Mirror of Erised. Shout out to Movie Flame for the idea. I haven't watched his video yet because I didn't want to taint my own thoughts and ideas, but I saw he already did this video idea last year. So Harry sees his parents in the Mirror of Erised in his first year at Hogwarts, but what might he see after the series is over? My first thought was that it would be largely the same for Harry. If he looked into the Mirror of Erised after the Battle of Hogwarts, maybe he'd see his parents, with Sirius and Remus. Maybe Tonks would be there too, and Fred, Mad-Eye Moody and Dumbledore, Snape even. Since we know Harry thinks he's the bravest man he's ever known. My first thought was that Harry would see everybody he'd lost there with him. But then I had a different thought. After Harry collects all 3 Hallows, he becomes the Master of Death, and he sees those that he's lost one last time. And then he throws the Resurrection Stone away. He makes peace with having lost the people he loved, and that nothing can bring them back. So I think if Harry were to look into the Mirror of Erised at the end of the Harry Potter series, all he'd see was him and Ginny, living a quiet and peaceful life. Happy. Maybe Ron and Hermione are there, but mostly Harry would truly desire a quiet life when he was finally done with being the chosen one. I think Ron Weasley is a typical teenager, and like any teenager, he'd change his mind about what he wants all the time. Him being head boy and Quidditch captain, like when he looks into the mirror during the Philosopher's Stone, well, I think that may stick with him for a while. We know in the Goblet of Fire, he feels very strongly about living in Harry's shadow, and being head boy and Quidditch captain means that finally the spotlight would be on him. But I think he would somewhat grow out of that by the end of the series. After all of the danger that he and Hermione were in, I think he would probably look into the Mirror of Erised and see himself settled down with Hermione, maybe with a big family of their own, and certainly with enough money to provide his children with the comforts that Arthur and Molly couldn't afford to give him, because as great as they were as parents, we know that Ron gets insecure about being poor. Hermione would look into the Mirror of Erised and see herself as Minister for Magic. She'd be Minister, and she'd be shaking hands with the Muggle Prime Minister. The scene would be her leading the wizarding world to living in harmony with Muggles. There would be free house elves all around her too, and her parents would probably be back with her, memories restored, happy and proud of what their daughter has become. I don't think what Dumbledore sees in the Mirror of Erised would change between the start and the end of the series. You see, he lies to Harry in the Philosopher's Stone when he says that he sees himself in the mirror with new socks. In actuality, Dumbledore almost certainly sees himself with his sister. She's still alive, and there was not a duel which led to her death. Perhaps he even sees the rest of his family. His brother, no longer resentful of him, his mother still alive. Maybe Grindelwald is there too, no longer corrupted, instead just devoted to Albus. Hagrid is so pure, I think we can all agree that he would look into the Mirror of Erised and see a world full of magical creatures. He'd look into the mirror and see himself on a huge farm with thestrals and hippogriffs flying around, Kneazles and centaurs and mooncalves grazing in the field by his feet. Madame Maxime may be there tending to the animals with him. Grawp and his Muggle father, both of whom Hagrid cared for dearly, they'd be there too. It would be such a lovely little scene. Severus Snape never got over Lily Potter, and despite any journey or growth his character may or may not have gone on during the series, his only true desire was for Lily to love him. And so that's what Snape would see in the Mirror of Erised. Him and Lily together, happy, his arms clear, never having bore the dark mark, and none of the guilt from telling Voldemort about the prophecy, leading to Lily and James's death. Maybe James is even there in Snape's vision in the mirror, as their servant or something, because deep down I think Snape's ego would really get a kick out of that. Voldemort would look into the mirror and see himself fully immortal, ruling over the wizarding world ever powerful. He'd be reigning the wizarding world from the Hogwarts headmaster's office, since we know how important Hogwarts was to him, and Harry Potter's corpse would lay lifeless at his feet. Voldemort only wanted immortality and power, and so he'd see exactly that in the Mirror of Erised. Sirius Black would look into the Mirror of Erised and see the Marauders, but he'd probably see their younger selves before he was sent to Azkaban, before Peter betrayed them, and before James died. Maybe he'd see them in their animagus form, because that's when Sirius was truly at his happiest, gallivanting with his friends in the grounds of Hogwarts, not a care in the world. Draco Malfoy is a complex one because so much of his personality feels forced on him. On the one hand, Draco loves power and his family's high standing in society. He loves to rub that in people's faces, and I think he might see himself as Minister for Magic when he looked in the mirror, perhaps. But on the other hand, by the end of the series, I think Draco wants to be his own man, maybe even to be good. Even though I do think Draco loves Lucius, I think he might see himself visiting his father in Azkaban when he looks in the mirror. His father paying for all of the things he did and for the life that he dragged Draco into. And Draco and his mother would be thriving without him, maybe. Draco was a tough one. Fred and George Weasley seem genuinely happy, so if we assume Fred looked into the mirror before his death, I think he'd largely see what his life actually was. He and George running the joke shop, bringing in enough money to give Molly, Arthur, and the other Weasleys the life that they deserve. The main thing I think Fred would see would be Molly approving of their life, saying that she's proud of them. Because for all the joking and mockery on the surface of things with Fred, I think his mother not believing in him would actually have hurt him, and that approval is what Fred would desire the most. I think if George Weasley looked into the Mirror of Erised at the end of the final book, he'd see himself standing over Fred's lifeless corpse laughing, counting all the money from the Weasleys' Wizard Wheezes empire that he now doesn't have to share. I am joking, of course. George would see Fred alive again, standing side by side, planning and plotting other pranks and more plans for their shop and their joke empire. That is all that George would want, to see the life that he lost with his brother. Personally, I want to say that Remus looks into the Mirror of Erised and sees himself married to Sirius Black, living the good life with their adopted children. It's a full moon outside, and Remus isn't a werewolf, just domestic bliss. I like to think that's the scene Remus would see in the Mirror of Erised. But Canon Remus would probably see himself with Tonks and Teddy, living domestic bliss. But I still think Sirius, James and Lily would be there too, the most important people in his life, seeing how he'd grown, seeing he was a father, seeing him not as a werewolf once again, because I think not being a werewolf would be key for Remus's deepest desires. Arthur sees his full and uncompromised family. Fred still alive, Bill not scarred by a werewolf. They're all gathered around, excitedly listening as Arthur holds up a rubber duck and perfectly describes what it does. His family are thrilled. They give him a standing ovation. The Muggle Prime Minister is there to give him a handshake. Arthur gets to share his love for Muggles with the people he loves the most, and that's what he'd see in the mirror. Neville Longbottom would look into the Mirror of Erised and see his parents patting him on the shoulder, asking him about all of his friends, of which he has many, and his parents know and remember them all. Neville is surrounded by all of these magical plants that are thriving under his care, and most importantly, Trevor the Toad is sat obediently in his hands, making no effort to escape. On the one hand, I thought Ginny might want a quiet and happy life with Harry and their kids. No war to fight, no reason they can't be together. But Ginny, book Ginny at least, is far more fiery than to want that simple domestic life. So she's going to see herself with about 6 different feats. She's a professional Quidditch player on the weekends, but during the week she's the best aura the Ministry has ever seen. She's dueling champion, a fantastic mum and wife, and she sees all of her siblings and nieces and nephews and just a really fulfilled life where she can do everything. I think that's what Ginny would see in the Mirror of Erised. Now there are some details on Pottermore that suggest McGonagall had a great love for a muggle man once upon a time. And so it might stand to reason then that she'd see the two of them if she looked into the Mirror of Erised, happy, growing old together. But sticking to what we know just from the books, I think McGonagall would see Hogwarts thriving. She's the headmistress after Dumbledore's death, the students are doing well, the school is the best it's ever been. I think McGonagall lives for that school and its students, and so making Hogwarts the best it could possibly be would be her deepest desire. Molly Weasley would look into the Mirror of Erised and just see her family, all alive, all safe, all happy. Fred is there, Percy is reunited with them, they're all wearing their knitted Christmas jumpers, and the extended family is there too, like Harry, Hermione and Fleur. Remus, Tonks and Teddy probably popped round as well. Just everybody that Molly loves, happy and safe. And she's cooking for them. That's what Molly would see in the mirror. Dolores Umbridge's lust for power consumes her, so if she looked into the Mirror of Erised, I think she'd see herself as Minister for Magic. She's wearing a coat made from centaur fur, and she's just made it illegal for Muggleborns, Squibs, and what she calls half-breeds to exist. She passed Educational Decree number 437, which makes fun, smiling, and talking illegal for all children. She holds the Daily Prophet in her hand, and the headline reads, Harry Potter admits he is a liar. And there are also about 1,000 pictures of cats. Not actual cats, because actual cats are too nice, and I don't think she'd actually like the real thing, but pictures of cats. She'd have loads of those. I think Moody would see himself in the Mirror of Erised, but his younger self. Him at his peak as an aura, physically fitter, mentally sharper, maybe even before he lost his eye. He'd be in the middle of a hunt for a dark wizard, thriving in his most natural environment. I genuinely think that's where Moody is most happy, and I think that's what he'd see in the mirror. I think Vernon Dursley, if he somehow found himself by the Mirror of Erised, would see mostly the life that he has, just with a few tweaks. Harry doesn't exist, and neither does magic in general. Petunia and Dudley, however, would be exactly the same. We know Vernon judges people based on materialistic things like the cars that they drive, and so his materialistic things in the mirror would be different. He's got the keys to a really expensive but respectable car, like a Bentley or a Jaguar. He's probably on a golf course with top-of-the-range clubs, Dudley playing with him, and Petunia complimenting him on his short game. The great, perfectly normal, mundane Muggle dream, and Vernon sees himself living it. Cornelius Fudge puts on a persona of being kind and likeable, but his true personality comes out in moments of high pressure, like when Sirius goes missing, when Cedric dies, and when Voldemort returns. Fudge is mostly a blithering idiot who just wants to stay in power. He clearly wants to be liked, revered even, but mostly he wants to stay in power. If he were to look into the mirror, he'd see himself as minister, people around him chanting his name, crowds holding signs of support and love for him. He'd see himself as the most popular Minister for Magic in Wizarding world history. So I genuinely believe that Peter regrets selling out the Potters and betraying his best friends. I think he was too far down the rabbit hole to go back on it, so he had to commit. But largely I think he regrets it. I also think no matter whether it was with the Marauders or with Voldemort's Death Eaters, Peter was deeply insecure and afraid. All he ever wanted was to fit in. I imagine Peter would see himself at Hogwarts before he'd made any decisions about being a spy or betraying his friends. He's still at school and he's immensely popular. He's not in Sirius or James's shadow. People like him for him. That's what I think Wormtail would see if he looked into the Mirror of Erised. Dobby is the most wholesome character, and so if he looked into the Mirror of Erised, I think he'd see a world in which he had hundreds of socks and hundreds of friends. Harry would be there, of course, because Harry is Dobby's favourite person, but Dobby loves having friends and being free. So his vision in the mirror would reflect that. Harry, socks, a room full of friends, and they're not even worshipping him. They're just all there. That's all Dobby would truly desire. Now, apart from the fact that he's a bully, we don't know a whole lot about Dudley Dursley, and by the end of the series, he seems to have matured out of the bully persona that he had in the earlier books. I genuinely think Dudley might see himself as a professional athlete if he looked into the Mirror of Erised, since he seems to get really into boxing late in the series. Or, controversially, maybe he would see himself waving a wand and being a wizard. Slughorn's main focus is surrounding himself with important and powerful people. He reveres his network in a way that seems to suggest that perhaps he lives vicariously through the people he forms connections with. He brags a lot, but rarely about what he's done himself, more about the people he knows, the people he's helped, and their achievements. So either Slughorn would look into the mirror and see a Slughorn gala, with the most glamorous party you'd ever see, full of the most popular, powerful, and famous wizards in the wizarding world, or, if we dive deeper, the fact he lives through those connections maybe hides his own insecurities about not having accomplished anything himself. In which case, maybe Slughorn would look into the Mirror of Erised and see himself as somebody important. Minister for Magic, a famous Quidditch player, editor of the Daily Prophet, somebody who has achieved something in their own right. Or as a third option, maybe he looks into the mirror and sees a world where he didn't tell Voldemort about the Horcruxes. Before the Deathly Hallows, Percy would 100% see himself as the Minister for Magic if he looked into the Mirror of Erised. His ambition was clear ever since the first book. He wanted to be important, and when he joined the Ministry, there's only one position he'd eventually be aiming for. But fast forward to the end of the Deathly Hallows and Percy has thrown away the Ministry for Magic and rejoined his family. He regrets how he treated them, and perhaps that's what would shape what he'd see in the Mirror of Erised. Or maybe it would be a mixture of both. Him as the minister, but now his father is his right-hand man, leading a ministry that stands for the kind of thing that would make the Weasleys proud. Where do we even start with Luna? Luna looking into the mirror could go in a number of different directions. My first thought was she'd see herself with loads of friends, because she doesn't seem to enjoy being ridiculed or mocked. But also, Luna does seem quite content with having a small number of good friends, like Neville, Ginny, and Harry. So maybe she looks into the mirror and she sees Nargles, crumple-horned Snorkax, dirigible plums, and all the other nonsense that she and her father believe in. Maybe she sees a world in which they all exist. Or maybe Luna is the most secure person in all of Harry Potter. Maybe she's so comfortable being her own, truly unique self that she looks into the mirror and just sees the life that she has. She's confident in her own beliefs, regardless of whether other people believe the same things, and she has a tight-knit group of friends who she loves. Maybe that's all she ever truly wanted. Petunia was clearly jealous of Lily being a witch. We see that in the flashbacks and some of the things that Petunia says when she talks about her sister. Petunia wanted to be a witch herself, and her resentment is what drove her and her sister so far apart in the end. So perhaps Petunia would look into the Mirror of Erised and see herself as a witch. Her and Lily stood side by side, sisters, friends, witches. And maybe it goes one step further and she sees Dudley and Harry with them, both of them magic as well. Even with his development by the end of the Deathly Hallows where he loved Harry, I think Kreacher still desperately longs for his master and mistress to come back. Kreacher would see himself in the mirror, with Regulus still alive, and probably Regulus and Sirius's mother too, and they would tell Kreacher how much they love and value him. And maybe after their relationship developed in the final book, Kreacher would see Harry there too, with his newfound love and respect for him. Argus Filch would look into the Mirror of Erised and see himself and Mrs. Norris at Hogwarts, but the corridors are empty. No student would be walking the corridors making a mess, no students would be laughing about their practical jokes, no students would be there at all. Filch would see an empty Hogwarts, except for the Weasley twins hanging from the ceiling, as that was Filch's dream punishment for them. And of course, Filch himself would have a wand, for he'd no longer be a squib in his deepest desire. Instead, he'd wave his wand to magically clean the walls and windows, because honestly, he'd probably still be a caretaker in this fantasy. Victor Krum is a tough one, because we don't know much about him, and much of what we do know is second-hand information from somebody like Hermione. But based on what we know, I think Krum low-key hates being famous. So if he looked into the Mirror of Erised, perhaps he would see himself as just a regular person. No crowds around him, rather a small group of close friends who like him for him. Maybe Hermione or some other girl who likes him for him as well gives him a kiss on the cheek. A normal life with people who like Victor Krum the person, not the famous seeker. I think that's what Krum would see. In the earlier books, I think Lockhart would look into the mirror and see himself as the most revered wizard in the wizarding world. He's holding another award for being brave or handsome or smart. A crowd of doting fans surround him. It's basically the life he lived, except without what was probably a crippling fear that he'd be caught out for being a fraud. Somehow Lockhart would know that the version of himself in the mirror was famous for actual true stories, and he didn't have a secret. And then after Lockhart loses his memory, perhaps the scene he sees in the mirror would be a little toned down. Fewer people surrounding him, fewer awards maybe, but mostly his personality and desires don't seem too different. For when the trio encounter him in St. Mungo's, he still offers them autographs. He still longs for fame, so maybe the thing he sees in the mirror would largely be the same. Sybil Trelawney desperately wants to be taken seriously for her gift, but she knows, deep down, beyond the delusion she spouts in class, that most of what she says is crap. So if she looked into the Mirror of Erised, I think Trelawney would see herself holding a book that she'd written. Much like her great-grandmother, Cassandra, who was a respected seer. She's surrounded by prophecies that she's made, and overall, she'd see herself as a respected, well-regarded, authentic seer. We don't really know much about Cho outside of the lens of Harry's romantic infatuation with her, but we do know that she loved Cedric, and that she was a damn good Quidditch seeker. So I think if Cho Chang were to look into the Mirror of Erised, she would see herself with the Quidditch Cup, Cedric on her arm, celebrating her accomplishments as her very much alive boyfriend. And after their awful date at Madame Puddifoot's tea shop, Harry is very much nowhere to be seen. Now I don't know if Mrs. Fig, unlike Argus Filch, the other squib we've discussed, would necessarily crave to be magic. From what we know about her, I think Mrs. Fig would look into the Mirror of Erised and see herself in her lounge with all of her cats. She'd have her non-magic friends and her magical friends there with her for company, drinking tea and coexisting happily. And I think she'd want to feel equally a part of both communities, with the Muggles and the Wizards. Because as a squib, I get the impression she feels like she doesn't truly belong in either, and that's why she just has a bunch of cats. Hedwig seems to mostly throw tantrums if she can't spread her wings and fly, so I think if she were able to look into the Mirror of Erised, if it worked for owls, particularly dead ones, she'd see herself flying freely in the open skies. Down on the ground, she'd look back and see Harry watching her. He's safe and happy, which she'd no doubt want as well. But mostly, she's free to fly and eat as she pleases. Rita Skeeter wants to just write headlines that people want to read. And like lots of gossip and tabloid journalists in the real world, I wonder if she got caught up in chasing the results and lost what drew her to journalism in the first place. And that's why she chased sensationalist clickbait headlines rather than true, hard-hitting stories. And so if Rita Skeeter looked into the Mirror of Erised, I imagine she'd see herself as a world-renowned journalist, winner of the wizarding world's equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize, holding a newspaper with a headline for a story she'd written about something truthful and really substantial. Maybe I'm naive, assuming the best in her, but I think that's what Rita would see in the Mirror of Erised. Peeves would look into the Mirror of Erised and see Hogwarts in perpetual chaos. Students running around, trying to avoid things that are flying through the sky. Teachers frantically trying to fix things and undo whatever chaos Peeves had caused. It wouldn't be so much so that the castle was ruined, because I do think Peeves loves it there, but enough to see that he has played prank after prank and had caused utter, irrevocable chaos. Xenophilius Lovegood is a strange fellow, and exploring the inner workings of his mind feels dangerous. But based on what we know about this eccentric man, I think if he were to look into the Mirror of Erised, he'd firstly see Luna thriving. Luna, as we find out in the Deathly Hallows, is his absolute priority. We'd see her happy, successful, and surrounded by the things that she loves. Xenophilius would also probably see all of the people in the mirror reading the Quibbler, because in his deepest desire, it would be a successful, popular, and sought out publication, and everybody would be nodding their heads in agreement that Xenophilius was correct about Stubby Boardman. Of course, everybody would also be dressed in absurd and ridiculous headdresses and robes, because in this deep desire, everybody recognizes the wondrous things Xenophilius writes about. Bellatrix Lestrange looking into the Mirror of Erised would be like anybody else looking into their deepest, darkest nightmares. Bellatrix is infatuated with Voldemort, so I think she'd see him recognizing her devotion. Whether that be romantically or not, I'm not 100% sure, but he's either kissing her or applauding her. Meanwhile, Bellatrix herself would likely have somebody like Neville or Hermione tied to a chair for her to torture, because she's a psychopath and she loves inflicting pain. And speaking of inflicting pain, have you ever wondered about the unforgivable curses that Bellatrix loves so much and how they might have been created? Well, I investigated that and made a video breakdown of my ideas in this video, which you'll want to watch next.